This week's lesson is on logic. We are going to be talking about types of logical arguments and how to evaluate different kinds of arguments. Before we get into specifics, here is a background quote from Aristotle on logic. Argument and teaching, I am afraid, are not effective in all cases. The soul of the listener must first have been conditioned by habits to the right kind of likes and dislikes, just as land must be cultivated before it is able to foster the seed. For a man whose life is guided by emotion will not listen to an argument that dissuades him, nor will he understand it. How can we possibly persuade a man like that to change his ways? And in general, it seems that emotion does not yield to argument, but only to force. Therefore, there must be first a character that somehow has an affinity for excellence or virtue, a character that loves what is noble and feels disgust at what is base. What Aristotle is trying to say here is, logic doesn't work for everybody. Some people are irrational and guided by emotion, and you can't reason with these people. You only have to hold them down by force. What Aristotle was talking about here reflects something I was taught at a seminar once, which I want to talk about here. There is a balance in all of us between logic and emotion. When you get too emotional, you lose the ability to reason. So if somebody is upset about something, you have to get them to calm down first before you can talk to them rationally. This is just an interesting thought which seems simple on the face of it, but I think reflects a deep truth that we should be aware of it in our lives. So once we've calmed down, take a deep breath, and are ready to engage in rational thought, that's when we can start talking about logical arguments. We define logic as using propositions to create premises which argue for conclusions. Remember, if you want someone to agree with you about something, you can't just state your conclusion. You have to explain the reasons behind your thinking. When you explain the reasons behind your thinking, what you're doing is spelling out your logical argument, the premises which are leading towards your conclusions. When you give someone premises they can agree with, when they share the inferences you hold, then you can come to an agreement about conclusions. Now here's a sample argument just to get you to start thinking in these terms. Okay, 5 plus 7 equals 12. We can think of the number 5 and adding 7 to it as premises. If we understand what 5 is, we understand what adding is, we understand what 7 is, then we can logically reason out that the conclusion of this mathematical argument is 12. So going forward, I want you to think of arguments in this sort of fashion, where you have a series of ideas and then a line at the bottom, and then whatever falls out of those ideas, the result of those ideas is the conclusion. The idea with this logical argument lesson is you want the premises that lead to your conclusion to make sense to other people. Generally speaking, good arguments provide grounds for accepting the conclusion, and bad arguments do not. Good and bad are relative terms depending on the degree of support for the conclusion. What we're going to talk about next are the two general forms of argument, deductive and inductive, as well as how to evaluate those kinds of arguments. Okay, inductive arguments are scientific in nature. They're based on experience. So you see something happen in the world and you build a concept and prediction. Remember the kid who doesn't want to touch the stove because it's hot. There's two ways to know that the stove is hot. Now, if you learn the hard way by burning your hand, then you can have an inductive argument. I burned my hand on the stove in the past, therefore it will be hot in the future. Deductive arguments go the other way. A deductive argument starts with the concept and then applies the concept to experience. So the kid who doesn't touch the stove, he can reason it out without burning himself. He says, stoves are by definition made to cook food, therefore they have to be hot. Chances are, if I put my hand on the stove, I can get burned. So without even touching the stove and burning myself, I can know in advance, just using concepts, that the stove will be hot. All right, let's talk a little bit more specifically about deductive arguments. Then we'll get a little more specific about inductive arguments. Okay, deductive arguments usually start off with a categorical premise, something that sounds like this: all things of this kind have that property. Then you take an example and you say it's in this kind and apply it. This particular thing is in that category, therefore we can deduce this property about it. I know this sounds abstract, so it's always helpful to use examples. This comes from Aristotle's first lessons on logic. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man. So you have this general category of men, and then you say that all men have this property of being mortal. That's your first premise. The second premise is to take an example of a man, Socrates. Okay, so if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, what can we logically deduce from these premises? That is, if these premises are true, what conclusion necessarily follows? That's right. Socrates is mortal is the conclusion here. How do we evaluate deductive arguments? We ask if it's valid and we ask if it's sound. This argument is valid as well as sound. And we're going to talk about the definitions of those terms in the next slide. Okay, a valid deductive argument is one in which the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. That is, if we assume for the sake of argument that the premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. We call that logically valid. The other measure of a deductive argument is to ask whether it's sound. Soundness is a sort of reality check. Does this argument make sense based on what we know about the world? You see, the thing is, you can create a valid deductive argument which is basically insane, okay? If I leave my light on while I am sleeping, Frankenstein won't come in my room and kill me. So tonight I'm going to leave my light on, therefore I will be safe from Frankenstein. This is a valid deductive argument. If you assume the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows. But is that a sound argument? No. Okay, Frankenstein is not real. So you can play tricks on yourself using logic and convince yourself that something is true because it's a valid argument, because the words make sense. We always have to check our reasoning against the real world. So let's do another example of how deductive arguments can be a little tricky. Okay, let's just talk about baseball. All right, let's assume for the sake of argument that everyone in Connecticut loves the Red Sox. Then I have John here, and he's from Connecticut. So if we assume the first premise is true and the second premise is true, what conclusion necessarily follows? That John loves the Red Sox. Now, is this a valid deductive argument? Is this a sound deductive argument? Remember, the question of whether an argument is valid depends on if the premises are true, and if they are, then the conclusion necessarily follows. So if these premises are true, does the conclusion necessarily follow? Yes, this is a valid deductive argument. If you consider just the words on the page, the conclusion follows necessarily. But there's a good reason why validity is not the only measure of a deductive argument's worth. We have to also ask, does this make sense based on what we know about the world? Okay, an argument may be valid but not sound. The way to determine whether an argument is sound or not is to put it up against what we know about the world. So a great way of thinking critically with logical arguments is to test our premises against counterexamples. Okay, does everyone in Connecticut love the Red Sox? Look around your life, people you know, maybe yourself. Do you know anybody from Connecticut who does not love the Red Sox? Well, let's just say that someone in this class does not love the Red Sox. So then we can get rid of that first premise through a counterexample. Again, counterexamples are a great way to think critically when evaluating arguments. Let's do another one. First premise: if something is illegal, that means it's wrong. It is illegal to leak classified documents. Edward Snowden leaked classified documents. Edward Snowden did something illegal. Edward Snowden was wrong to leak classified documents. Now, this is a valid deductive argument. If we assume the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows. Now, is this a sound deductive argument? Well, there we would question at least the first premise. Is it true that just because something is illegal, that it's automatically wrong? That's where there's room for debate. That's where, with logic, we have the terms of the debate, but logic is only one of the tools for critical thinking. You can have a valid deductive argument make rational sense and have people agree with you because your argument is constructed properly. But it doesn't always mean that you are correct in your thinking or that your reasoning matches up with reality. Okay, so that's all I have on deductive arguments. Remember, a valid deductive argument is one in which the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. That is, if the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows. And as we saw with those two examples, it's possible to create a valid deductive argument while it is not sound. And I'll leave the Snowden example for you to decide the soundness on that argument. Okay, let's talk a little bit about inductive arguments. As we said before, these arguments are scientific in nature. You take experience, evidence, and you build towards a conclusion, usually having something to do with a future prediction. Okay, the sun rose 2 days ago, the sun rose yesterday, the sun rose today. Based on this past experience, what can we conclude about tomorrow? The sun will rise tomorrow. Based on our experience of the past, we're making a prediction about the future. This is an inductive argument. Now, to evaluate an inductive argument, what we don't say is that it's valid or not valid, or sound or not sound. The way to evaluate an inductive argument is to say whether it's strong or weak. Now, this idea that the sun will rise tomorrow, I would say, is a pretty strong argument based on all the experience we have of the sun rising every day throughout human history. What makes an argument strong or weak is how much evidence you have towards your conclusion. Okay, we have thousands and thousands of days in the past where the sun has risen before, so it's a pretty good argument. It's a strong argument to say it will rise tomorrow. The more evidence you have towards your inductive argument's conclusion, the stronger your argument is. Now, just like deductive arguments have their flaws, there is a little bit of a crack in the armor of inductive arguments. Okay, do we know for sure that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? If we're totally honest with ourselves, we have to acknowledge that there's a slim possibility that something goes totally wrong with the solar system or the universe or a black hole or who knows what, okay? There's a 0.0000001% chance that the sun will not rise tomorrow. So we don't know that the sun's going to rise tomorrow with total certainty. Okay, inductive arguments, scientific arguments are a best estimate of the future, but it's not total certainty. This problem has been called by philosophers the problem of induction, that there's always the possibility that things could go wrong, that experience could change. Some people call these things black swan events. Life goes on as normal, everything as it's been in the past, and then it changes. So there's always that 1 in a million chance that something different can happen. Okay, another form of argument is induction by analogy. An analogy is an argument in which a conclusion is drawn about a situation based on similarities to previous situations. So I have knowledge and experience in one realm, and then I have this other realm that I'm not so experienced with, but based on their perceived similarities, I'm going to draw a conclusion about this other category. I like apples because they are sweet fruits. I've never had an orange before, but I'm told that they're also sweet fruits. So I compare one category that I have experience with to another category that I don't have experience with. I draw an induction by analogy, and I conclude I might like oranges. Okay? There we have a comparison between apples and oranges based on induction by analogy. Okay, thus concludes the first part of the lesson. We talked about deductive arguments and how those are constructed and evaluated, inductive arguments and how those are constructed and evaluated, and there's more on those topics in the assigned reading. In this week's discussion, think of some arguments that you've heard lately and try to figure out, are they deductive or inductive, and then evaluate them. Are they strong or weak? Are they valid? Are they sound? Post some sample arguments on the discussion board, offer your analysis, and we'll work on them as a class. Next, we're going to talk about some different issues with constructing arguments, and then we will talk about bad forms of arguments. Okay, I want to talk for a minute about relevant premises. Okay, we want the premises of our arguments to be reasonable. Okay, the premise should lead towards the conclusion. And this strange relationship of what makes a premise lead towards a conclusion we call inferences. Now, one way to construct a bad argument is to have premises that have no relevance to the conclusion, or at least no relevance to what we might call a rational person. Okay, put yourself in the mind of a courtroom juror, and the defense lawyer is presenting his closing argument. And he says, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client killed someone. We can all agree on that. We've seen the footage. But he's a really nice guy. He's polite to me. He complimented me on my suit. He asked me about my family. He bought me a soda and all these sorts of things. So we don't have to convict him of murder, do we?" Now, hopefully we would say that the fact that the defendant is a nice guy is an irrelevant premise towards his guilt or innocence in a court of law. Hopefully a rational person sitting on the jury would see that as irrelevant. The funny thing about human beings is they don't always agree on what's relevant and what's rational. So I can tell you that certain premises are irrelevant towards a conclusion and that they're irrational. But beware of the potential irrationality of human beings. Okay, let's talk now about unstated premises. There are premises that must be assumed in order to make the argument work. A lot of times in our readings and in our conversations with people, they will offer up one premise and then state their conclusion and kind of leave out a couple of things. And then you have to ask the question, are you trying to say that this is what leads to that and that this is part of what causes your conclusion? When you're trying to draw somebody's unstated premises out, that's a really good way of thinking critically, just to be clear what people's reasoning is. When you articulate hidden premises, sometimes you can surprise yourself with the hidden thinking behind your logic. Let's do a simple example. Moore's dog is a bloodhound. Therefore, Moore's dog has a keen sense of smell. We have one premise and we have our conclusion, but is there a missing premise in there? Yes, most bloodhounds have a keen sense of smell. So we just want to make sure that we're on the same page with people. All their premises are articulated. Once we understand their premises are fully disclosed, then we can understand how they got to their conclusion. Okay, now we can talk for a second about non-arguments. Just because you see a series of sentences leading to another sentence, that doesn't mean you have a logical argument. The sky is blue, cars have wheels, therefore dogs have 4 legs. Not really a logical argument, just a couple of sentences thrown together. All right, let's talk about bad arguments. We're going to look at a couple forms of arguments that are commonly found in public discourse but are reflective of faulty logic. First up, we have appeal to authority. This is where you justify your conclusions not based on your own reasons, but based on what someone else said. God said, "Thou shalt not kill, therefore thou shalt not kill." Why is this flawed logic? Hopefully there are more reasons to not kill somebody than the fact that God said not to do it. What if suddenly you lose your faith in God? Does that mean you're going to start killing people? Hopefully not. So we want people to have their own reasons for doing things, their own foundational beliefs, and not just an appeal to authority. How to avoid these? Make conclusion based on your own reasoning, not what someone else has said. Next up, the naturalistic fallacy. This is where you assume that just because something is natural, that it's okay. Men are naturally aggressive, competitive, and sexually promiscuous. Therefore, men should be aggressive, competitive, and sexually promiscuous. Unfortunately, this is another thing that people think. You hear it articulated as, come on, it's natural, we are only human beings, and it's okay to go along with this. Okay, beware. Now we have this one, the false dilemma. This is where you see an issue in terms of only one side or the other, when there is actually room for interpretation in between. Seeing things in terms of black or white when there is actually gray area. You turn a messy and complicated debate into a simple pick a side kind of a thing. Students of Taoist philosophy will know this is a very Western way of looking at things. In contrast to having to pick a side, Lao Tzu would have us embrace the ambiguity and uncertainty of the world and beware the dangers of a false dilemma. A false dilemma from recent history was in a post 9/11 speech where President George Bush said, either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. Now, in the emotional time of the post 9/11 world, that may have sounded reasonable. But remember, when emotions run high, logic fails us. Isn't it possible to be critical of the US government and not be a terrorist? I would hope so. Okay, here's another one, a little Latin phrase for you, ad hominem, which means about the man. This is where you make the argument not about the issue itself, but about the person making it. You turn it into a personal attack. How do you avoid these types of argument? You can disagree with a person without turning it into a personal attack. Disagree with their reasons, their premises, their inferences, their conclusions, but don't just pick on qualities of the person's identity. Next up, we have the slippery slope. This is where you jump to conclusions about the future based on insufficient past experience. If drugs are legalized, then everyone will want to do them, everyone will become addicted, and our society will crumble. You start out at the top of the mountain and you fly down at high speed until you crash into the wall. The reason slippery slope arguments get a lot of traction with people is because the future is unknown, and you're playing on people's fear of the unknown, the fear of the possibility that things could spin out of control. How do you avoid a slippery slope argument? You have to make sure each premise is sound and the conclusion represents an inference from your premises that any reasonable person would make. Now again, what is reasonable? Remember the courtroom scene. Some juror might think that a nice guy shouldn't get convicted of murder. Similarly, some voter might think one thing might lead to another, therefore we shouldn't vote for this new policy. So it's very undetermined what exactly a reasonable person is. Next up, the straw man fallacy. Think of a straw man and ask, can they defend themselves? Now, what you do with a straw man argument is you make your opponent's views seem so ridiculous that only a foolish person would take them seriously. You turn your opponent into a straw man, someone incapable of reasonably defending themselves. So you take what they're saying, you look at their argument, and you manipulate it around. You turn it around on them and you make it into something unreasonable. You create a straw man out of their views. This example comes from Bill Maher and comments he made about religion. Okay, he says, if you're Christian, then you believe in a talking snake, implying that all Christians are somehow insane or irrational because, yes, you have this Garden of Eden mythology with a talking snake and all that. But again, what Bill Maher is doing, he's taking centuries of tradition and theology and boiling it down to a single mythical event and saying, yeah, there's all that complicated stuff they talk about, but do you believe in a talking snake or not? This is a straw man argument. How to avoid these. Take the person you disagree with seriously. Try to get into their heads. Try to think how they think. Try to take as sympathetic a perspective as possible when considering someone else's views. If you still disagree with them, deal with the challenging parts of their views, not just the most easily refuted. So if you have a problem with Christianity, don't debate the mythology. The talking snake, the virgin birth, the resurrection, those are all sort of miraculous things which are irrational to a lot of people. But what about the question of loving your neighbor as yourself? Is that so easily dismissed? That's a little bit harder to turn into a ridiculous view, although there is room for argument there. Here's another form of argument, the hasty generalization. This is where you take a few examples and use them to represent the whole. Okay, the Crusades were fought in the name of religion. Therefore, all religion is a source of conflict and violence. Now, both of those sentences can be debated, but this idea that one example can be generalized to the whole, we would call a hasty generalization. How do you avoid these type of arguments? You have to be careful not to assume that all individuals in a category are identical. Here's our last form of bad argument. It's called begging the question. What you do here is you assume that by stating your conclusion in the form of a premise towards a conclusion, that you have done any argumentative work. Rather than explaining the reasoning behind your thinking, you are just stating your conclusion in different ways. This is sometimes referred to as circular reasoning. Circular reasoning works because circular reasoning works because circular reasoning works, right? Remember, the way we construct an argument is with premises working towards a conclusion. You start at the top and you work your way down. With a question-begging argument or a circular reasoning argument, you don't go from top to bottom. You find yourself looping back up to the top again. Let's look at a few examples. If it's illegal, then it's wrong. But aren't there unjust laws? That's impossible. Something that is right would never be illegal. Use common sense. You see, the premise is in the conclusion. The conclusion is in the premise. The thinking is circular. If something is illegal, then it's wrong. If it's wrong, then it's illegal. If it's illegal, then it's wrong. There's no breaking the circle. There's no getting into that person's thinking because it's all locked in together. They've begged the question. Mankind can never have an impact on the planet. We are just too small. All of this talk of climate change is illogical. We cannot impact the climate. There's no need to go green and be environmentally conscious because there's nothing we can do that will affect the environment for good or for bad. How is this not sinking into you people? It's as clear as day. Thus concludes our lesson on logic, but of course our work is only just beginning. Take some time to go over the reading. Think about some arguments that have been presented lately in the public discourse. What kind of argument is being used? Is it inductive? Is it deductive? How can we evaluate these arguments? Are there any unstated premises? Are there any irrelevant premises? Are there any bad forms of argument that you've heard lately? Find some examples, bring them to the discussion board, and we'll work on figuring out what's going on there. Thank you for your attention and participation. Have a great rest of your week.